Commander Zefkar of the Hegemony Third Fleet had lived through 700 rotations around the galactic core, witnessed the rise and fall of dozen civilizations, and commanded fleets that had reduced entire star systems to cosmic dust. His exoskeleton bore the ritual scars of 1,000 victories, each one a testament to the Hegemony's absolute dominance over the known galaxy. Yet as he stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Dominion, watching the tactical display with all four of his compound eyes, something cold and alien crawled up his spine, an emotion he had thought himself incapable of feeling. Fear. The blue-green world spinning lazily in the void before them should have been nothing more than another conquest, another primitive civilization to be absorbed into the Hegemony's ever-expanding empire. Intelligence reports had been clear. The inhabitants called themselves humans, had barely achieved interplanetary flight, and possessed technology roughly equivalent to what the Hegemony had mastered 15,000 years ago. It should have been a routine cleansing operation. Drop from hyperspace, deploy the atmospheric processors, harvest the world's resources, and catalog any useful genetic material for the biotanks. But the humans had surprised them. The first hint that something was wrong came when the advanced scout ships failed to report back. Zefkar had assumed it was equipment failure or perhaps some kind of primitive defensive satellite network, nothing that couldn't be swept aside with a proper battle group. The second hint came when long-range sensors detected massive gravitational anomalies in the outer system, signatures unlike anything in the Hegemony's extensive databases. Still, Zefkar had pressed forward. The Hegemony had faced unknown technologies before. They always proved inferior to the tried and tested methods that had conquered half the galaxy. The third hint came when they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of what the humans called the Sol system, and Zefkar's tactical officer, a seasoned Krell warrior who had never shown fear in 3 centuries of service, made a sound that no Krell throat should have been capable of producing. It was somewhere between a death rattle and a prayer. "Commander," the tactical officer whispered, his voice barely registering on the bridge's audio sensors, "you need to see this." The main display flickered to life, and Zefkar felt his certainty crumble like ancient stone. Where there should have been empty space punctuated by a few primitive mining stations, the void was filled with things, massive angular constructs that dwarfed even the Hegemony's largest dreadnoughts. They moved with purpose and precision through the dark between worlds, their hulls gleaming with an almost organic luminescence that seemed to pulse with contained power. But it wasn't their size that made Zefkar's internal temperature drop by several degrees. It was their design. Every civilization the Hegemony had encountered followed certain universal principles of starship construction. Smooth curves to deflect energy weapons, redundant shielding systems, weapon arrays positioned for maximum coverage and minimum vulnerability. These human vessels violated every known law of military engineering. They were angular where they should be curved, exposed where they should be protected, and covered in what appeared to be decorative elements that served no tactical purpose. And yet, "Analysis report," Zefkar commanded, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his thorax. "Sir," his science officer began, her mandibles clicking nervously, "preliminary scans indicate these vessels are constructed from materials we don't recognize. The energy signatures are unusual. They're not running on fusion, antimatter, or any known propulsion system. It's almost as if they're—" She paused, recalibrating her instruments. "Sir, it's almost as if they're drawing power directly from local space-time." Zefkar felt his confidence wavering. The Hegemony's scientists had theorized about zero-point energy extraction for millennia, but had never achieved practical application. If these humans had mastered such technology, it would explain the gravitational anomalies his sensors had detected. Weapons analysis. The tactical officer's report was even more disturbing. "Unknown energy projection systems, sir. The weapon ports don't match any configuration in our databases. But, sir, that's not the strangest part." He gestured to a section of the display where one of the human vessels was rotating slowly, revealing its full profile. "Look at the hull markings." Zefkar looked and felt something deep inside his consciousness recoil. Painted across the dark metal of the human ship's hull, in symbols that somehow managed to convey menace despite their alien origin, were images that defied explanation. Creatures with bared fangs and wild manes, stylized representations of death and destruction, and strangest of all, symbols that seemed to represent the humans themselves, but not as they appeared in the intelligence reports. These humans were depicted as warriors. "Sir," the communications officer announced, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet." Zefkar straightened, calling upon 7 centuries of command experience to steady his voice. "Put it through." The main display shifted, and for the first time in his long military career, Zefkar found himself looking at a human face. The creature, the person, he corrected himself, was unlike anything he had expected. Where the intelligence reports had suggested a soft, weak species dependent on technology for survival, the being before him radiated a quiet confidence that made Zefkar's own achievements feel suddenly insignificant. The human was relatively young by galactic standards, probably no more than 50 local years, with dark skin marked by scars that spoke of personal combat rather than industrial accidents. Her eyes, those strange, forward-facing organs that marked humans as evolved predators, held a depth of intelligence that made Zefkar reassess every assumption he had made about this species. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. You have entered sovereign human space without authorization and with what our sensors indicate is hostile intent." She paused, and Zefkar could see other humans moving purposefully in the background of the transmission, their movements coordinated with military precision. "You have exactly one opportunity to withdraw your fleet beyond the heliopause. If you choose not to take it, we will consider your presence an act of war." Zefkar felt his mandibles spread in what his species considered a display of dominance and amusement. "I am Commander Zefkar of the Hegemony Third Fleet. Your world is scheduled for resource extraction and population relocation. You will stand down your primitive vessels and prepare for planetary occupation. Resistance will result in the total sterilization of your system." The human Admiral Chen did something unexpected. She smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Commander," she said, her voice taking on a tone that somehow managed to be both conversational and deeply threatening, "I think there's something you should know about humanity before you make any irreversible decisions." The transmission shifted, and Zefkar found himself looking at what appeared to be a historical archive. Images of humans engaged in primitive warfare flashed across the screen. But as he watched, the time frame advanced, and the scale of destruction grew exponentially. He saw humans fighting with crude metal weapons, then with chemical explosives, then with nuclear fire that turned entire cities into glass. But it didn't stop there. The images continued advancing through time, showing humans developing more and more sophisticated methods of warfare. Orbital bombardment platforms, relativistic kill vehicles, weapons that could collapse stars. And throughout it all, the humans themselves remained constant, always finding new ways to kill, always pushing the boundaries of destruction, always fighting. Always winning. "You see, Commander," Admiral Chen's voice continued over the historical montage, "we've been preparing for this moment for a very long time. When we first detected signals from other civilizations, we realized we weren't alone in the universe. That was educational." The display shifted again, showing what appeared to be captured alien technology, but not just any alien technology. Zefkar recognized fragments of hegemony design, pieces of equipment that should have been impossible for humans to acquire. His internal temperature dropped another degree. "We've been studying you, Commander, all of you, every civilization that thinks it owns the galaxy. We've been very patient, very careful, and very thorough." Admiral Chen's image returned to the screen, and now Zefkar could see something in her eyes that made his ancient warrior's instincts scream warnings. "Did you really think you were the first to find us?" Before Zefkar could respond, alarms began sounding throughout his ship. His sensor operator's voice cracked as she delivered her report. "Sir, massive energy spikes throughout the system. The human vessels are... They're powering up weapons we can't identify." Zefkar looked at the tactical display and felt the last of his confidence evaporate. The human ships weren't just powering up, They were transforming. Hull sections were sliding apart to reveal weapon arrays that defied every principle of physics he understood. Energy readings were climbing beyond what his instruments could measure. And most terrifying of all, more ships were appearing. Not arriving, appearing. As if they had been there all along, hidden by technology that made a mockery of the hegemony's most advanced stealth systems. "Last chance, Commander," Admiral Chen said, and her voice carried the promise of annihilation. "Withdraw now or learn why every species that has ever encountered humanity in battle has the same word in their language for us." Zefkar's translator systems had been working throughout the conversation, automatically processing the human language and providing real-time conversion. But suddenly, a new word appeared on his display, a human word that his systems struggled to translate, finally settling on a phrase that made his ichor run cold. "The Reapers." "What?" Zefkar whispered. "What do you call yourselves?" Admiral Chen's smile widened, revealing the sharp, cutting teeth of an apex predator. "We call ourselves human," she said, "but everyone else calls us something different." The display around Zefkar's ship suddenly filled with targeting lasers, thousands of them, originating from weapons platforms he hadn't even known were there. His shields started failing before the humans had even fired a shot, overwhelmed by scanning beams that seemed designed to find every weakness in his ship's defenses. "They call us," Admiral Chen continued, "the species that ends wars." The moment Admiral Chen's transmission ended, Zefkar's universe fundamentally changed. Not metaphorically, literally. The space around his fleet began to warp and twist in ways that violated every law of physics he had spent 7 centuries learning to understand. His ship's AI, a quantum consciousness that had calculated the trajectories of 10,000 battles, began producing error reports faster than its organic handlers could process them. "Commander," his navigation officer shrieked, all pretense of military composure abandoned. "Local space-time is destabilizing. Our position is becoming uncertain." Through the observation ports, Zefkar could see reality itself seeming to bend around the human vessels. Stars that had been fixed points of reference for millions of years were shifting position, creating constellation patterns that hurt to look at directly. The familiar comfort of three-dimensional space was being replaced by something that his mind struggled to comprehend, geometries that folded in on themselves, distances that changed depending on the angle of observation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the humans were moving through this chaos as if it were perfectly normal. "Sir," his science officer reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "the humans aren't just manipulating local space-time. They're navigating through dimensions we can't even detect. Our sensors are picking up movement patterns that suggest they're using folded space as a tactical advantage." Zefkar forced himself to think like the military commander he had been for 700 years. "Battle stations. All ships. Form defensive formation Hegemony 7. Activate temporal shields and prepare for—" "Sir," the communications officer's interruption was unprecedented. In Hegemony military protocol, interrupting a superior during combat orders was grounds for immediate execution. But the terror in her voice made such considerations irrelevant. "We're receiving another transmission, but sir, it's not coming from the human ships." "Then where's?" "It's coming from behind us." Every head on the bridge turned toward the main display as it flickered to life again. But instead of Admiral Chen's face, they found themselves looking at another human, this one older, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of ages. He wore what appeared to be a simple military uniform, but there was something about his presence that made the air itself seem heavier. "Commander Zefkar," the human said, and his pronunciation of the alien name was perfect, too perfect, as if he had been studying their language for far longer than should have been possible. "My name is General Marcus Webb, Terran Strategic Command. I believe we need to have a conversation." "Impossible," Zefkar muttered. "There are no human ships in our rear position we would have detected." "Actually," General Webb interrupted gently, "you wouldn't have. May I suggest you take a look at your tactical display again?" Zefkar's eyes swiveled to the holographic representation of local space, and his world tilted on its axis. The display showed his fleet exactly where it should be, but now, surrounding them in a perfect sphere, were dozens of human vessels. Not the angular dreadnoughts they had first encountered, but something far worse. Ships that seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, their hulls shifting between solid matter and something that his instruments insisted was simultaneously there and not there. When, Zefkar whispered, "When did you?" "We've been here the entire time," General Webb replied. "In fact, we've been here for approximately 47 of your years, waiting." The word hit Zefkar like a physical blow. Waiting for what? General Webb's expression shifted, and for a moment, Zefkar saw something in the human's eyes that made him understand why predators throughout the galaxy whispered fearful stories about humanity in the darkness between stars. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something far more terrifying. It was pity. Waiting for you to make the same mistake that every other species has made, General Webb said softly. You see, Commander, humanity learned a very important lesson during our early expansion into space. We learned that the universe is a very dangerous place, filled with civilizations that view diplomacy as weakness and peace as an opportunity for conquest. The display around them shifted again, and Zefkar found himself looking at historical records that couldn't possibly exist. Battle footage from hegemony conflicts that had occurred in sectors hundreds of light years away. Engagement records from wars that had been classified at the highest levels of hegemony command. Tactical analyses of strategies that only a handful of high-ranking officers should have known. You've been watching, Zefkar realized, his voice hollow with the implications. All this time you've been watching everything. Learning, General Webb corrected. Studying. Preparing. Did you think that a species capable of splitting atoms and bending space-time to our will would limit ourselves to one small solar system simply because we chose not to announce our presence to the galaxy? A new voice cut through the bridge's communication system. Admiral Chen again, but her transmission was coming from impossibly close range. Too close. Zefkar's sensors indicated that her ship was now less than 1,000 kilometers away, but that was impossible. His fleet's defensive perimeter should have prevented any approach. General Webb is being diplomatic, Admiral Chen said, her voice carrying an edge that made the bridge temperature seem to drop. Let me be more direct. Commander Zefkar, your hegemony has been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of reality in this galaxy. The tactical display shifted again, and now Zefkar could see the true scope of what they faced. The human vessels weren't just surrounding his fleet. They were surrounding it in dimensions that his three-dimensional thinking couldn't properly process. Ships that existed partially in normal space and partially elsewhere. Weapons that seemed to be aimed not at his vessel's current positions, but at where they would be several seconds in the future. Your species, Admiral Chen continued, developed faster-than-light travel through brute force manipulation of space-time. You tear holes in reality and force your way through them, leaving scars that take centuries to heal. Your weapons work by overwhelming enemy defenses with raw power, regardless of collateral damage to local space. Your entire military philosophy is based on the assumption that the universe is a thing to be conquered rather than understood. Zefkar tried to respond, but Admiral Chen wasn't finished. Humanity took a different path. When we discovered that consciousness itself could interact with quantum fields, we didn't try to dominate that interaction. We learned to dance with it. When we realized that space-time was not a barrier but a medium, we didn't tear through it. We learned to swim. The implications were staggering. If humans had achieved true quantum consciousness integration, if they had learned to manipulate reality at the fundamental level rather than simply overpowering it with technology, then everything the hegemony understood about warfare, about power, about the nature of civilization itself, was obsolete. But that's not why we're here, General Webb said, and his voice carried a weight that made Zefkar realize this conversation was about to take an even darker turn. We're here because 47 years ago, we detected the approach of your fleet. We've been tracking your progress through hegemony space, watching as you systematically destroyed 17 different civilizations on your way to our system. Zefkar felt his thorax constrict. Those 17 worlds had been routine operations, barely worth remembering among the thousands of conquests in his military record. But the way General Webb spoke about them suggested that humanity somehow considered them significant. Each of those civilizations, Admiral Chen's voice rejoined the conversation, sent distress calls before you exterminated them. Did you know that, Commander? In their final moments, as your atmospheric processors turned their worlds into lifeless rocks, they broadcast desperate pleas for help into the void. They called out to any listening civilization, begging for rescue, for intervention, for anyone to bear witness to their extinction. The bridge around Zefkar had gone completely silent. Even the usually reliable hum of the ship's system seemed muted, as if the vessel itself was holding its breath. "We heard them," General Webb said quietly. "Every single one. We recorded their last words, cataloged their final messages to the universe, preserved their cultural databases and genetic patterns. We became the guardians of 17 dead civilizations because we arrived too late to save them." The tactical display shifted once more, and now Zefkar was looking at something that made his command training feel inadequate. The space around his fleet was filled not just with human vessels, but with ships bearing the design aesthetics of civilizations he recognized. Civilizations his fleet had destroyed years ago. Impossible vessels crewed by beings who should have been extinct. Their technology somehow merged with human engineering in ways that created something entirely new. "You see," Admiral Chen explained, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than any battle cry, "humanity has a peculiar trait that your intelligence reports probably missed. We have a very difficult time accepting permanent loss. When we find something beautiful that has been destroyed, we have a tendency to bring it back." Zefkar's mind reeled. Resurrection technology, but the energy requirements alone would be impossible using conventional physics, General Webb agreed. Fortunately, humanity stopped limiting itself to conventional physics sometime around the 23rd century. It turns out that when you learn to interface consciousness directly with quantum mechanics, death becomes significantly more negotiable. The bridge's air recycling system was working harder now, struggling to process the stress pheromones being released by Zefkar's crew. He could feel his own certainty dissolving like salt in water. Everything he had believed about the natural order of the universe was being systematically dismantled by these impossible humans and their impossible technology. "But that still doesn't explain why we're having this conversation," Admiral Chen said, her image returning to the main display. "If we simply wanted to destroy your fleet, you would already be dead. If we wanted to capture your vessels, your crews would already be in our holding cells. We're talking because humanity has a proposition for you." Despite everything, despite the impossible ships, the resurrected civilizations, the casual dismissal of physics itself, Zefkar felt a spark of hope. Perhaps there was still a way out of this nightmare that didn't end with the complete destruction of everything he had ever known. "What kind of proposition?" Admiral Chen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The kind that acknowledges an uncomfortable truth about this galaxy, Commander. You're not the first species to achieve interstellar dominance through conquest. You're not even the 10th, but you are the first to do so during humanity's watch." General Webb took over the explanation. 47 years ago, when we first detected your fleet, we faced a choice. We could have intervened immediately, used our technology to stop your expansion before it claimed a single additional world. But we realized that would only be treating the symptom, not the disease. Zefkar found himself leaning forward despite his fear. "What disease?" "The disease of believing that power gives you the right to exterminate other forms of consciousness," Admiral Chen replied. "It's a common evolutionary dead end, Commander. Species develop the technology to travel between stars, encounter other civilizations, and assume that technological superiority equals moral authority. It's happened thousands of times throughout galactic history." The tactical display shifted to show a map of the galaxy that was unlike anything in hegemony databases. Instead of the relatively empty space they had assumed existed beyond their borders, Zefkar saw a complex web of civilizations, trade routes, and political boundaries that suggested a galactic community of staggering complexity. The galaxy is not the empty hunting ground your species believes it to be, General Webb explained. There are currently over 50,000 spacefaring civilizations in this galaxy alone, most of them living in careful balance with each other. Your hegemony controls approximately 0.3% of inhabited space. The number hit Zefkar like a physical blow. The hegemony's maps showed them controlling nearly a quarter of known space, with vast empty regions beyond their borders waiting to be claimed. If General Webb was telling the truth, then everything Zefkar had believed about his civilization's place in the universe was a lie. But why, he managed to ask, why haven't we encountered them? Admiral Chen's smile returned, and this time it held a hint of genuine warmth. Because, Commander, most mature civilizations have learned the value of staying hidden from species like yours. The galaxy has protocols for dealing with aggressive expansion civilizations. Usually, they involve patient observation followed by careful intervention when the expanding species reaches a predetermined threat threshold. We are that intervention, General Webb added. Humanity accepted the role of shepherds, you might say. When a species like yours reaches the point where it threatens galactic stability, we step in to offer an alternative path forward. Zefkar felt something that might have been relief, but it was immediately overwhelmed by suspicion. And if we refuse this alternative path? The silence that followed his question was answer enough. Around his fleet, the human vessels continued their impossible dance through folded space, their weapons charged with energies that could unmake matter at the quantum level. The tactical display showed threat assessments that his computers simply labeled as insufficient data for calculation, a phrase that had never appeared in hegemony military systems before. Commander, Admiral Chen said finally, let me share something with you that might help put this situation in perspective. 3 months ago, we received a priority transmission from a hegemony research facility in the Kepler 442 system. Are you familiar with that facility? Zefkar's internal temperature plummeted. Kepler 442 housed the hegemony's most classified research projects, experiments in consciousness transfer, dimensional manipulation, and temporal warfare that were considered too dangerous for implementation anywhere near inhabited systems. The facility's existence was known only to the highest levels of hegemony command. That facility was working on something called Project Eternity, Admiral Chen continued. An attempt to develop weapons that could eliminate entire civilizations by erasing them from the timeline itself. Fascinating technology, really. We were quite impressed by the theoretical framework. The tactical officer beside Zefkar made a sound that was part whimper, part prayer. Sir, he whispered, Project Eternity was activated 2 days ago. If the humans know about it, if they intercepted the transmission. Oh, we didn't just intercept the transmission, General Webb interjected. We responded to it. The research team at Kepler 442 was quite surprised to discover that their temporal manipulation experiment had attracted the attention of beings who had mastered temporal mechanics roughly 2 centuries before your species achieved spaceflight. Zefkar's mind raced through the implications. If humanity had temporal manipulation technology, if they could move through time as easily as they moved through space, then this entire encounter might be happening in a timeline that had already been altered by human intervention. For all he knew, the original timeline might have ended with the complete destruction of Earth, and this conversation was taking place in a reality where humanity had simply decided to edit the historical record. You're wondering if this is real, Admiral Chen observed, apparently reading his expression with disturbing accuracy. If the timeline you're experiencing is the original one, or if we've already rewritten history to suit our purposes. It's a natural question, Commander, and I'm afraid the answer is both more complex and more simple than you might expect. The space around Zefkar's fleet continued to writhe with energies that made his instruments scream warnings about imminent reality collapse. But somehow, impossibly, his ships remained intact and functional. It was as if the humans were carefully controlling their demonstration of power, revealing just enough to make their point without actually causing irreversible damage. "The simple answer," General Webb said, "is that this is the only timeline that matters. Whatever might have happened in other potential realities is irrelevant. What matters is what happens next in this reality based on the choices you make in the next few minutes." Zefkar tried to process the strategic situation, but every assumption he made was immediately contradicted by new evidence of human capabilities. His fleet, which had seemed invincible just moments ago, was now revealed to be nothing more than a collection of primitive metal shells floating helplessly in a web of forces beyond their comprehension. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally. Admiral Chen's expression grew serious. "We want you to understand something fundamental about humanity, Commander. We didn't develop our technology through conquest or domination. We developed it through cooperation with each other, with our environment, and eventually with reality itself. Every major breakthrough in human science came from learning to work with natural forces rather than trying to overpower them." The display shifted to show what appeared to be historical records of human development, but these were unlike any technological progression Zefkar had ever seen. Instead of the typical pattern of increasingly powerful weapons and more efficient resource extraction methods, humanity's advancement seemed to focus on integration and synthesis. They had learned to merge biological and mechanical systems, to create technology that was grown rather than built, to develop tools that enhanced natural capabilities rather than replacing them. "When humanity first achieved interstellar travel," General Webb continued, "we made contact with a civilization called the Architects, beings who had learned to manipulate matter at the molecular level. Instead of conquering them, we learned from them. When we encountered the Harmonies, who could communicate through quantum entanglement across vast distances, we integrated their communication methods into our own technology." Zefkar realized what they were describing. "You've been building an alliance." "We've been building something much more than an alliance," Admiral Chen corrected. "We've been building a new form of civilization itself, one based on the revolutionary concept that the universe contains enough resources and space for everyone if we're willing to cooperate rather than compete for dominance." The philosophical implications were staggering. The hegemony's entire social structure was built on the assumption of scarcity, that there wasn't enough space, resources, or energy in the universe for multiple civilizations to coexist at high levels of development. Every military strategy, every expansion policy, every cultural norm was based on the fundamental belief that survival required the elimination of potential competitors. "But if that's true," Zefkar said slowly, "then why are your weapons so advanced? Why do you have the capability to destroy entire fleets?" The silence that followed his question was different from the previous pauses in their conversation. This one felt heavy with the weight of history, with decisions that had been made in the crucible of unimaginable conflicts. "Because," Admiral Chen said finally, "we learned that pacifism and defenselessness are not the same thing. Humanity spent centuries believing that our desire for peace would be respected by others. We believed that rational beings would naturally choose cooperation over conflict when presented with clear evidence of mutual benefit." General Webb's voice took on a harder edge. "We were wrong. The universe contains species that view compassion as weakness, cooperation as vulnerability, and peace as an invitation to attack. Humanity learned to be prepared for such species while still maintaining our commitment to cooperation with those willing to embrace it." The tactical display around them suddenly changed, showing not just the current engagement, but what appeared to be a real-time map of the entire galaxy. Zefkar could see the hegemony's territory clearly marked, but now he could also see the vast networks of civilizations that existed beyond their borders. Hundreds of thousands of worlds connected by trade routes, communication networks, and mutual defense pacts that formed a web of cooperation spanning the galaxy. "Your hegemony," Admiral Chen continued, "exists in what we call a contact buffer zone, a region of space deliberately kept isolated from the greater galactic community, until its dominant civilization demonstrates either the wisdom to choose cooperation or the intractability that requires more permanent solutions. Zefkar felt his worldview collapsing entirely. You mean we've been quarantined? Think of it as a trial period, General Webb said gently. Every spacefaring civilization goes through the same process. They develop interstellar capability, begin expanding into nearby systems, and eventually encounter the choice point where they must decide whether to continue their expansion through conquest or to seek integration with the broader galactic community. And if they choose conquest? The pause that followed was answer enough, but Admiral Chen provided the details anyway. Then they encounter humanity, and humanity provides them with a final opportunity to reconsider their choice. Around Zefkar's fleet, the human vessels began to move in patterns that defied three-dimensional logic. They weren't simply maneuvering through space. They were maneuvering through time itself, creating tactical positions that existed across multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously. His fleet's targeting systems couldn't lock onto enemies that were simultaneously in the past, present, and future. The offer we're making, General Webb said, is integration. Your species has valuable perspectives, unique technologies, and cultural insights that could benefit the galactic community. But that integration requires abandoning the philosophy of conquest that has defined your civilization for the past millennium. Zefkar looked around his bridge, seeing his crew's expressions of fear and confusion reflected in his own growing uncertainty. And if we refuse? Admiral Chen's expression didn't change, but somehow her next words carried the weight of absolute finality. Then you will discover why, in over 40,000 years of galactic civilization, no conquest-based species has ever successfully challenged the cooperative framework that governs this galaxy. The tactical display flickered one final time, and Zefkar found himself looking at something that made his consciousness reel with the implications. It was a graveyard, not of ships or planets, but of entire civilizations. Massive structures that had once been the pride of galactic empires, now floating silent and empty in the void. And orbiting each dead megastructure was a simple marker beacon, broadcasting a message in the universal mathematical language that all spacefaring species eventually developed. The message was simple: they chose conquest. We give every species the same choice, Admiral Chen said softly. The same opportunity to join something greater than themselves. Most choose wisdom. Some, she gestured toward the graveyard display, some choose to test whether humanity's reputation is deserved. Zefkar stared at the evidence of humanity's power and felt something shift deep within his consciousness. For 700 years, he had believed that strength was the only currency that mattered in the universe. He had climbed through the ranks of hegemony military command by being stronger, faster, and more ruthless than his competitors. He had conquered worlds and destroyed civilizations because he believed that the alternative was being conquered and destroyed himself. But now, faced with beings who possessed power beyond imagination, yet chose to offer mercy rather than simply taking what they wanted, Zefkar was forced to confront the possibility that everything he had ever believed about the nature of existence was fundamentally wrong. "How long," he whispered, "how long do we have to decide?" Admiral Chen consulted something beyond the range of the transmission pickup. "Your fleet has been in our system for approximately 17 minutes. During that time, our quantum monitoring systems have detected 2,847 separate targeting solutions being calculated by your weapon systems, 156 attempts to penetrate our defensive networks, and 23 separate communications to hegemony command requesting reinforcements." Zefkar felt his exoskeleton flush with embarrassment. He had indeed ordered his crew to attempt all of those actions, but quietly, using encrypted channels that should have been undetectable. "We're not angry about any of that," General Webb added quickly. "They're exactly the actions we would expect from a well-trained military commander facing an unknown threat, but they do indicate that you're still thinking in terms of conflict rather than cooperation. So to answer your question, you have as long as it takes for you to genuinely consider our offer. But Commander..." "Yes." General Webb's expression grew grave. While you're considering, I should mention that our long-range sensors have detected 3 additional hegemony fleets en route to this system. If they arrive before you've made your decision, the situation will become significantly more complicated. The implication was clear. Humanity's offer of peaceful integration was limited to Zefkar's fleet. If additional hegemony forces arrived with aggressive intent, humanity's response might be less diplomatic. Zefkar closed his eyes and tried to imagine a universe where cooperation was possible, where his species might find a place among the stars without having to destroy everyone else to claim it. It was a concept so alien to everything he had been taught that his mind struggled to process it. But as he opened his eyes and looked at the impossible human vessels dancing through dimensions that shouldn't exist, Zefkar began to realize that perhaps the most alien concept of all was the possibility that humanity might actually be offering his species a chance at redemption. The decision should have been simple. Faced with overwhelming force and the clear superiority of human technology, any rational military commander would have ordered immediate surrender. But as Zefkar stood on his bridge, watching his crew struggle to comprehend the impossible situation they faced, he realized that the choice before him was far more complex than simple military capitulation. Behind him, his communications officer was frantically working to establish contact with Hegemony High Command, her mandibles clicking in the rapid pattern that indicated extreme stress. The quantum entanglement communicators that normally provided instantaneous contact across any distance were producing nothing but static, and Zefkar was beginning to suspect that humanity's mastery of quantum mechanics extended to communications disruption as well. "Sir," his science officer reported, her voice trembling with implications she was only beginning to understand. "I've been analyzing the energy signatures from the human vessels. Commander, these aren't just advanced technologies. They're operating on principles that suggest a fundamental understanding of reality that our science considers impossible." Zefkar turned toward her, grateful for any distraction from the weight of the decision he was being forced to make. "Explain." "The human ships aren't drawing power from any external source we can identify. They appear to be converting consciousness itself into usable energy. But that would require—" She paused, her instruments recalibrating themselves as they struggled to process readings that shouldn't exist. "Sir, that would require treating consciousness as a fundamental force of nature, like gravity or electromagnetism." The implications hit Zefkar like a nova shockwave. If humans had learned to weaponize consciousness itself, then they possessed capabilities that went beyond technology into the realm of what his species would consider magic. No wonder their intelligence reports had been so inadequate. How could conventional surveillance methods gather information about beings who could manipulate reality through the sheer force of their awareness? "Commander," Admiral Chen's voice cut through his contemplation, "I can see you're struggling with the philosophical implications of what we're telling you. That's understandable. Most species require time to adjust their worldview when they first encounter consciousness-based technology. But I'm afraid we have a more immediate problem." The main display shifted to show the edge of the solar system, where space itself was beginning to shimmer with the telltale distortions of hyperspace emergence. Zefkar's heart sank as he recognized the energy signatures, 3 hegemony battle fleets, exactly as General Webb had predicted. "Fleet Admiral Thakmer," Zefkar muttered, identifying the lead ship's configuration. "He commands the first armada." "Ah," General Webb said, his tone carrying a note of what might have been regret. "Fleet Admiral Thakmer. Yes, we're familiar with his tactical record. Sterilized the Andromedan colonies, orchestrated the extinction of the Crystal Singers, pioneered the atmospheric burn techniques used in the Vega massacres. An impressive resume from a certain perspective." The casual way the human listed Thakmer's most classified operations sent chills through Zefkar's entire crew. These humans knew everything, not just about hegemony military capabilities, but about specific commanders, specific operations, specific war crimes that were buried in the deepest archives of military intelligence. "Admiral Chen," Zefkar said, his voice carrying a formality that felt absurd given their circumstances, "I need to ask you directly. What happens to my crew if I choose to accept your offer of integration? The question that had been lurking beneath the surface of their entire conversation finally broke through. Zefkar could feel his officers listening intently, their own fears and hopes hanging on the humans' response. They were soldiers, trained to follow orders and die for the hegemony, but they were also living beings with their own desires for survival and meaning. Admiral Chen's expression softened, and for the first time since the conversation began, Zefkar saw something in her eyes that reminded him that humans, despite their impossible technology, were still fundamentally people. "Your crew would be given the same choice you're being offered," she said gently. "Those who choose integration would undergo a process we call perspective expansion, a gradual introduction to the broader galactic community and the scientific principles that govern consciousness-based technology. And those who refuse would be relocated to a suitable world within hegemony space and allowed to live their lives in peace," General Webb replied. "We don't force cooperation, Commander. We've learned that forced cooperation isn't really cooperation at all." Zefkar felt something that might have been relief, but it was immediately complicated by a new concern. What about the hegemony itself? My people, my homeworld, what happens to them? The pause that followed was longer than any previous silence in their conversation, and Zefkar could sense the weight of difficult truths being carefully considered. "That," Admiral Chen said finally, "depends largely on how they respond to what happens here today. If your government chooses to view your fleet's integration as an opportunity to learn and grow, then humanity will work with them to find a path toward peaceful coexistence. If they choose to view it as an act of war." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The graveyard of dead civilizations was still displayed on secondary monitors around the bridge, their empty structures serving as silent testimony to what happened to species that chose conquest over cooperation. "But Admiral," Zefkar said, a new thought occurring to him, "my government won't have a choice. When Fleet Admiral Thakmer arrives and finds my fleet cooperating with you, he'll interpret it as treason. He'll attack regardless of the consequences." General Webb nodded gravely. "Yes, we expect he will, which brings us to the real test, Commander." The space around them suddenly filled with new energy signatures as the human fleet began moving into positions that Zefkar's tactical training recognized as pre-engagement formations. But these weren't the defensive positions he would have expected. They were something entirely different. "We're not asking you to choose between your species and ours," Admiral Chen explained. "We're asking you to help us save your species from itself. Fleet Admiral Thakmer represents everything about hegemony culture that prevents your people from joining the galactic community. He is, in many ways, the embodiment of the conquest mentality that has trapped your civilization in its current evolutionary dead end." The implications of what she was suggesting hit Zefkar like a plasma bolt to the cortex. "You want me to help you fight other hegemony forces? We want you to help us demonstrate to the hegemony leadership that there are alternatives to conquest," General Webb corrected. "Thakmer will arrive expecting to find either your fleet victorious over primitive humans or your fleet destroyed by superior alien technology. He will not be prepared for what he actually finds." As if summoned by their conversation, the first of Thakmer's ships began emerging from hyperspace at the system's edge. The massive dreadnought Inevitable Victory materialized first, its hull scarred from 1,000 battles and bristling with enough firepower to crack continents. Behind it came the rest of the First Armada, 47 ships representing the absolute pinnacle of hegemony military might. Zefkar watched the emergence with growing dread. He knew Thakmer personally, had served under him during the Rigel campaign. The fleet admiral was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely convinced of hegemony superiority. He would view any suggestion of cooperation with aliens as weakness worthy of execution. "Admiral Chen," Zefkar said urgently, "you don't understand. Thakmer won't negotiate. He won't listen to offers of integration or cooperation. He'll see your fleet as a threat to be eliminated, regardless of your technological advantages." "We know," Admiral Chen replied calmly. "We've been monitoring his communications since his fleet left hegemony space. We know exactly what kind of commander he is. The main display shifted to show intercepted hegemony communications, including private conversations between Thakmer and his senior staff. Zefkar listened with growing horror as his superior discussed plans for the complete sterilization of the Sol system, the harvesting of human genetic material for biological weapons research, and the establishment of a permanent military base in Earth's orbit. He's planning to use Earth as a forward staging area for further expansion, Zefkar realized. Yes, General Webb confirmed. And according to his strategic briefings, he considers your fleet's failure to report in as evidence that humans possess military capabilities worth studying. He's not here to rescue you, Commander. He's here to complete your mission and acquire human technology for the hegemony war machine. The revelation added another layer of complexity to Zefkar's decision. If he chose to cooperate with humanity, he wouldn't just be betraying the hegemony. He would be actively working against his own species' military interests. But if he refused, he would be condemning not just his own crew, but potentially his entire civilization to the consequences of challenging beings who could manipulate time and space as easily as he could give orders. "There's something else you should know," Admiral Chen said, her tone growing more serious. "Something about why humanity has been so patient with the hegemony despite your species' history of aggression." The display shifted again, and Zefkar found himself looking at what appeared to be genetic analysis charts. Complex molecular structures that his science training allowed him to partially interpret, but which contained patterns he had never seen before. "Your species," General Webb explained, "carries genetic markers that indicate descent from a civilization that humanity encountered approximately 8 centuries ago. They called themselves the Builders, and they were." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "They were very important to us." Zefkar felt his consciousness reel with the implications. The Builders, but they're mythological. Hegemony creation stories speak of them as the ancient ones who gave us the gift of intelligence, but there's no archaeological evidence. "There's no archaeological evidence because they didn't evolve on your homeworld," Admiral Chen interrupted gently. "The Builders were a spacefaring civilization that seeded dozens of worlds with enhanced genetic material before she hesitated, before they chose to transcend physical existence entirely." The philosophical bombshell left Zefkar speechless. If humanity was telling the truth, then the hegemony's entire understanding of their own origins was incorrect. They weren't a naturally evolved species that had achieved spaceflight through their own efforts. They were the descendants of an ancient civilization that had been guided toward intelligence by beings who had since ascended to some form of post-physical existence. "But why does that matter?" he managed to ask. General Webb's expression grew distant, as if he were remembering events from long ago. "Because the Builders asked us to watch over their children. They knew that species guided toward intelligence rather than evolving it naturally often struggle with the moral implications of power. They asked humanity to serve as mentors, you might say, to help their descendants find wisdom before they destroyed themselves." The weight of revelation was becoming almost unbearable. Everything Zefkar had believed about his species, his mission, his purpose in the universe was being systematically deconstructed by beings who seemed to know more about hegemony history than the hegemony itself. "So this entire encounter," he said slowly, "this isn't about conquest or defense, it's about education." "It's about evolution," Admiral Chen corrected. "Not biological evolution, conscious evolution. The development of awareness and wisdom that allows a species to transcend the cycle of competition and scarcity that traps most civilizations in endless conflict." Around them, Thakmer's fleet was completing its emergence from hyperspace and beginning to form attack formations. Zefkar could see the tactical precision that had made the First Armada legendary throughout hegemony space, overlapping fields of fire, redundant defensive positions, and support vessels positioned to maximize the fleet's collective destructive capability. "Admiral," Zefkar said urgently, "you need to understand, Thakmer won't be impressed by demonstrations of superior technology. He'll interpret them as challenges to be overcome. If you show him what you showed me, he'll consider it a declaration of war." Admiral Chen nodded gravely. We know, which is why we're not going to show him what we showed you. The casual statement sent ice through Zefkar's veins. What are you going to show him? General Webb's expression grew grim. We're going to show him what happens when an immature civilization encounters a mature one and chooses violence. Before Zefkar could ask for clarification, his communications officer announced that they were receiving a transmission from the First Armada. Thakmer's scarred face appeared on the display, his 4 eyes blazing with the cold fury that had made him legendary among hegemony commanders. Commander Zefkar, Thakmer's voice carried across space with the authority of absolute command. Report your status immediately. Why have you not begun atmospheric processing operations? Zefkar felt the weight of 7 centuries of military training warring with the new understanding that humanity had forced upon him. He could lie, could try to buy more time, could attempt to explain the situation in terms that Thakmer might accept. But looking at his old commander's expression, seeing the familiar mixture of arrogance and barely contained violence that had once inspired him, Zefkar realized that no amount of explanation would change what was about to happen. Thakmer had already seen the human fleet. He had already made his decision. Sir, Zefkar said formally, I request permission to discuss the tactical situation with you privately. Thakmer's eyes narrowed. Denied. Report your status, Commander, or I will consider you compromised by alien influence. The threat was unmistakable. In hegemony military law, being compromised by alien influence was a crime punishable by immediate termination, not just of the individual, but of their entire crew. Zefkar felt his options narrowing to a single, impossible choice. Sir, he said carefully, the human civilization possesses technological capabilities that exceed our initial intelligence estimates. I recommend caution before. Enough, Thakmer's voice cut through the transmission like a plasma cutter. You have 30 seconds to resume your attack on the human fleet, or I will consider your vessel's enemy combatants and act accordingly. The communication ended, leaving Zefkar's bridge in stunned silence. Around them, the sensors showed Thakmer's fleet spreading into battle formation, their weapons powering up to full combat readiness. In 30 seconds, the First Armada would begin its attack, and Zefkar would be forced to choose between his loyalty to the hegemony and his growing conviction that humanity offered something unprecedented in galactic history. Commander, Admiral Chen's voice returned to the bridge speakers, but now there was something different in her tone, a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of historical inevitability. I'm sorry. We had hoped that your species' leadership would prove more flexible. This isn't over, Zefkar said desperately. If you could just give me more time to explain to him. Time has run out, General Webb interrupted, his voice heavy with finality. Thakmer has made his choice, and now we must honor the consequences of that choice. But, Commander, you still have a decision to make. Zefkar looked around his bridge, seeing his crew's faces reflecting his own internal struggle. These were good soldiers who had followed him through dozens of campaigns, trusted him to lead them through dangers that would have destroyed lesser commanders. They deserved better than being caught between 2 impossible alternatives. What decision? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Admiral Chen's image returned to the main display, and now Zefkar could see other humans working purposefully in the background, technicians and officers preparing for something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this region of space. You can order your fleet to join Thakmer's attack, she said quietly, in which case you'll discover firsthand why no conquest-based civilization has ever successfully challenged humanity. Or you can choose to protect him. The words hit Zefkar like a physical blow. Protect him, protect Thakmer. General Webb nodded solemnly. Despite his flaws, despite his crimes, Thakmer represents billions of hegemony citizens who have never been given the opportunity to choose cooperation over conquest. If he dies here today, he becomes a martyr for the conquest philosophy. If he survives and witnesses what humanity is truly capable of, he becomes something potentially more valuable. What's that? A teacher, Admiral Chen replied. Someone who can return to hegemony space and explain to your leadership exactly what they're facing. Someone whose testimony they can't dismiss as alien propaganda or primitive deception. Zefkar felt his tactical mind racing through the implications. If Thakmer could be convinced, if he could somehow be made to understand what Zefkar was beginning to grasp about humanity's true nature, then perhaps there was a path forward that didn't end with the complete destruction of everything he had ever known. But convincing Thakmer would require surviving the next few minutes, and the Fleet Admiral's battle formations were already moving into attack position. "How," Zefkar asked, "how exactly do you expect me to protect him from you?" The answer came not in words, but in action. Around Zefkar's ship, the fabric of spacetime began to fold in ways that his instruments described as geometrically impossible. His fleet, which had been trapped in defensive positions between the human vessels and Thakmer's approaching armada, suddenly found itself elsewhere, not moved through space, but translated to a position that offered tactical advantages he had never imagined possible. "We've given you weapons," General Webb explained as Zefkar watched his ship systems integrate technologies that hadn't existed moments before. "Not our weapons, weapons designed specifically for your vessels, based on principles your species can understand and operate. They won't make you our equals, but they will allow you to intervene in what's about to happen." Zefkar stared at the impossible readings flowing across his tactical displays. His ship's weapon arrays had been enhanced with systems that seemed to operate on hybrid principles, part conventional physics, part consciousness-based manipulation. His shields were no longer simple energy barriers, but complex fields that could interact with multiple dimensions simultaneously. "But why?" he asked, genuinely confused by the human's actions. "Why give us the capability to oppose you?" Admiral Chen's smile was sad and knowing. "Because, Commander, the choice has to be real. If we simply overwhelmed Thakmer with superior force, he would learn nothing except that humanity is stronger than the hegemony. But if he sees his own people choosing to stand against him, if he realizes that his own commanders have found something worth risking everything to protect, then perhaps he'll begin to understand what we're really offering." The tactical display suddenly erupted with activity as Thakmer's fleet completed its battle formation and launched its first wave of attacks. Plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes filled the space between the fleets, creating a deadly light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented the opening moves of what could become the most significant battle in galactic history. But the human response was unlike anything Zefkar had ever witnessed. Instead of returning fire with equivalent weapons, the human ships began to move in patterns that seemed to dance around the incoming attacks. Plasma bolts that should have struck their hulls simply missed, as if the ships existed in spaces slightly adjacent to where they appeared to be. Quantum torpedoes that should have locked onto their energy signatures instead curved away harmlessly, their guidance systems apparently confused by targets that existed in multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. "They're not fighting," Zefkar realized with growing amazement. "They're not even defending themselves in any conventional sense." "No," Admiral Chen confirmed. "We're demonstrating. Watch carefully, Commander." As Zefkar watched, one of the human vessels, a sleek craft no larger than a hegemony destroyer, moved directly into the path of a concentrated barrage from 3 of Thakmer's dreadnoughts. The combined firepower should have vaporized the ship instantly, but instead, something extraordinary happened. The human vessel absorbed the energy. Not deflected it, not redirected it, but actually absorbed the destructive force and converted it into something else. The ship's hull began to glow with accumulated power, and when it moved again, it left trails of light in space that spelled out symbols in the universal mathematical language. The symbols formed a simple message: "We could have destroyed you at any time." Zefkar felt his mandibles spread in involuntary amazement. The humans weren't just demonstrating superior technology. They were communicating through the medium of battle itself, turning Thakmer's aggression into a conversation about the nature of power and its proper use. But Thakmer, predictably, interpreted the demonstration as mockery. "All ships," his voice crackled across hegemony communication frequencies, Maximum bombardment. These aliens dare to play games with the First Armada. Show them the true meaning of hegemony power. What followed was the most intense barrage Zefkar had ever witnessed. Thakmar's fleet unleashed everything: planet crackers, star killers, weapons that could ignite atmospheric gases and turn worlds into funeral pyres. The amount of destructive force being directed at the human fleet should have been sufficient to sterilize several solar systems. The humans continued their impossible dance, moving through the storm of destruction like swimmers navigating gentle currents. But now Zefkar could see something else happening, something that made his tactical instincts scream warnings about forces beyond his comprehension. The human ships were learning. With each wave of attacks, their movements became more precise, their responses more perfectly calibrated to negate hegemony weapons systems. It was as if they were downloading the tactical knowledge directly from Thakmar's fire control computers and using it to optimize their defensive strategies in real time. "Commander," General Webb's voice cut through Zefkar's amazement, "this is your moment. In approximately 30 seconds, Thakmar is going to realize that conventional weapons are ineffective against our fleet. He will then activate the First Armada's experimental temporal disruptor array, a weapon designed to erase targets from the timeline itself." Zefkar's ichor went cold. He had heard rumors about the temporal disruptors, but had assumed they were theoretical research projects. If Thakmar actually deployed such weapons... "The temporal disruptors will work," Admiral Chen said quietly. "They'll erase several of our ships from existence, along with the approximately 40,000 human crew members aboard them. And that, Commander, is when humanity will stop being patient." The choice crystallized in Zefkar's mind with perfect clarity. He could remain passive and watch as Thakmar escalated the conflict beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Or he could act to prevent his species from crossing a line that would make them irreconcilable enemies of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. "All ships," he commanded, his voice carrying across his fleet's communication network with the authority of absolute decision. "This is Commander Zefkar. Target the First Armada's temporal disruptor arrays and prepare to fire on my command." The silence that followed his order was deafening. For a moment, Zefkar wondered if his crew would follow him into what amounted to mutiny against the highest levels of hegemony command. Then, one by one, his ship commanders began reporting their readiness to engage. "Sir," his tactical officer said quietly, "weapons locked on target." Zefkar looked at the tactical display one final time, seeing the threads of cause and effect spreading out from this moment like ripples in a quantum pond. Whatever he chose now would echo through history, shaping the relationship between humanity and the hegemony for generations to come. "Fire," he commanded. The space between the fleets erupted in new patterns of destruction, as Zefkar's enhanced weapons struck Thakmar's temporal arrays with precision that surprised even his own gunners. The hybrid human hegemony technology performed exactly as promised, disabling the most dangerous weapons in the First Armada's arsenal without causing significant casualties. But the effect on Thakmar was exactly what Zefkar had feared. "Traitor!" The fleet admiral's voice exploded across all communication frequencies, his rage so intense that it caused feedback in the transmission systems. "You dare raise weapons against your own kind for these alien parasites? I will see you flayed alive for this betrayal." "Admiral Thakmar," Admiral Chen's voice cut through the hegemony commander's fury with calm authority. "You now have a choice to make. You can continue your attack and discover what happens when humanity stops demonstrating restraint, or you can listen to what Commander Zefkar is trying to tell you about the true nature of this encounter." Thakmar's response was everything Zefkar had expected and feared. "I will listen to nothing from alien scum. All ships, target the traitor fleet first. We will cleanse this system of both human and hegemony weakness." As the First Armada's weapons swiveled toward Zefkar's position, he felt a moment of perfect clarity. He had made his choice, committed himself to a path that his ancestors would have considered unthinkable. But looking at the human vessels around him, seeing beings who possessed the power to destroy galaxies yet chose to offer mercy instead, Zefkar realized that perhaps his ancestors had been wrong about more than just the nature of strength. "Admiral Chen," he said formally, "my fleet stands ready to assist in the defense of this system." Her response was simple, but it carried the weight of acceptance into something larger than himself. "Welcome to the Galactic community, Commander Zefkar." And then the real battle began. What followed defied every principle of warfare that had been written in the millennia since the first sentient being had raised a weapon against another. It wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of power so absolute, so fundamentally overwhelming, that it transcended violence and became something approaching art. Thakmer's first armada unleashed hell itself upon the combined human and loyalist hegemony forces. Starkiller missiles that could ignite gas giants streaked through space, alongside relativistic projectiles accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. The quantum cascade weapons that had reduced the Crystal Singer homeworld to subatomic particles painted the void with destructive energies that should have torn holes in reality itself. And humanity caught them all. Not intercepted, not deflected, not absorbed, caught, as if the most destructive weapons in hegemony history were nothing more than thrown stones being plucked from the air by a patient adult dealing with an angry child. The human vessels moved through the barrage with motions that seemed almost casual, their hulls rippling with energies that transformed incoming destruction into something else entirely. "By the ancient codes," Zefkar whispered, watching his instruments struggle to categorize what they were seeing. "They're converting the weapons into energy for their own systems." But even that wasn't the most disturbing part of humanity's response. The most disturbing part was what they did with Thakmer's most devastating attacks, the ones that missed their intended targets and streaked toward inhabited worlds in the outer system. They healed them. Zefkar watched in stunned silence as quantum cascade weapons that should have stripped Mars of its terraforming infrastructure instead struck the planet and somehow enhanced it. The energy that should have boiled away the newly created atmosphere instead stabilized it, creating weather patterns more complex and stable than anything in the planet's geological history. Colony structures that should have been vaporized were instead reinforced and improved, their environmental systems upgraded to standards that exceeded anything in hegemony technology. "They're not just defending," his science officer reported, her voice filled with religious awe. "They're creating. Every weapon that misses its target is being converted into terraforming energy." The philosophical implications were staggering. Humanity had achieved such mastery over the fundamental forces of reality that they could transform instruments of destruction into tools of creation in real time. They weren't fighting Thakmer's attack. They were healing the universe of its effects. But Thakmer, predictably, interpreted humanity's restraint as mockery. "Enough games," his voice roared across all frequencies. "If you want to play with forces beyond your comprehension, then face the true power of the hegemony." What happened next made Zefkar realize that everything they had witnessed so far had been humanity's attempt to avoid unleashing their true capabilities. As Thakmer's flagship began charging what could only be the legendary reality anchor, a weapon that could freeze space-time itself and render any target completely vulnerable to conventional attack, the human fleet's demeanor changed completely. For the first time since the encounter began, Admiral Chen's voice carried genuine anger. "General Webb," she said, her words clipped with professional fury, "Fleet Admiral Thakmer has just authorized the use of a reality anchor against our position. Such weapons cause irreversible damage to local space-time and threaten the stability of inhabited systems throughout this galactic arm." "Confirmed, Admiral," General Webb replied, his own voice hardening with resolve. "The Fleet Admiral has escalated beyond acceptable parameters. Authorization granted for Strategic Response Protocol 7. Zefkar had no idea what Strategic Response Protocol 7 entailed, but the way both humans spoke about it suggested something that would fundamentally alter the nature of their conflict. Around his fleet, the human vessels began to move in patterns that made his navigation systems give up entirely, and display error messages in languages his computer claimed didn't exist. Commander Zefkar, Admiral Chen's voice cut through the growing chaos. What I'm about to show you will change your understanding of what warfare means in a universe where consciousness is a fundamental force. I want you to remember that everything you're about to witness could have been avoided if Fleet Admiral Thakmer had chosen cooperation over conquest. The space around Thakmer's flagship began to change, not warping or bending like the dimensional manipulations Zefkar had witnessed earlier, but changing at a level so fundamental that his instruments couldn't find words to describe it. Reality itself was being rewritten, restructured according to principles that operated beyond the reach of conventional physics. And then Zefkar saw something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his extended life. One of the human dreadnoughts, a vessel that had seemed impossibly large when he first encountered it, began to unfold. Not like a mechanical transformation, but like a flower blooming if flowers were made of crystallized spacetime and petals of pure consciousness given physical form. As it expanded, Zefkar realized that what he had thought was a single ship was actually a gateway, a doorway into something that his mind struggled to comprehend. Through that gateway came others. Not more human ships, but vessels that carried the design aesthetics of every civilization that had ever achieved consciousness-based technology. Ships that sang with harmonies that could be felt rather than heard, craft that moved like living things through dimensions that intersected with normal space in ways that created impossible geometries. The collective, General Webb announced, his voice carrying the weight of historical significance. Representatives of every civilization that has chosen cooperation over conquest, unity over domination. They've come to witness Thakmer's choice. Zefkar's compound eyes tracked dozens of alien vessel designs, recognizing some from historical records and others that seemed to represent species his civilization had never encountered. But all of them shared certain characteristics. They moved with purpose rather than aggression. Their energy signatures suggested harmony rather than conflict, and their very presence seemed to make the surrounding space more stable rather than less. "This is what the galaxy looks like, Commander," Admiral Chen explained as more vessels continued to emerge from the dimensional gateway. "This is the civilization that exists beyond your quarantine zone. Thousands of species working together, sharing knowledge and resources, exploring the universe through cooperation rather than conquest." The sight was overwhelming, not just because of the number of alien civilizations represented, but because of what their cooperation implied. If this many species could work together successfully, if they could share technology and resources without falling into the competitive cycles that had defined hegemony existence, then perhaps the universe really was large enough for everyone. But Thakmer's response to the revelation was everything Zefkar had feared it would be. "Alien Alliance," the Fleet Admiral's voice carried across space with the fury of absolute conviction. "They seek to corrupt us with their weakness. All ships prepare the Nova protocols. We will cleanse this system of their contamination even if we must ignite the star itself." The Nova protocols. Zefkar felt his thorax constrict with horror. He had heard whispers about the ultimate hegemony weapon, a device that could destabilize stellar cores and turn entire star systems into weapons of mass destruction. But he had assumed they were theoretical, too dangerous even for the hegemony's aggressive military doctrine. "Sir," his weapons officer reported, his voice tight with fear, "the First Armada is deploying stellar destabilization charges. If they activate the Nova protocols..." "Every world in this system dies," Zefkar finished, "including Earth." The mathematical certainty of mutual annihilation hung over the bridge like a death sentence. Even if humanity could somehow survive a stellar explosion, which seemed unlikely despite their impossible technology, the loss of Earth would eliminate the heart of the cooperative civilization they had spent centuries building. But Admiral Chen's response to Thakmer's ultimate threat was not fear or desperate negotiation. It was laughter. Not cruel laughter or mocking dismissal, but the warm, genuine amusement of someone who had just heard a particularly absurd joke. The sound carried across the communication channels and somehow made the universe feel less terrifying and more human. "General Webb," she said, her voice bright with barely contained mirth. "Did you hear that? Fleet Admiral Thakmer wants to ignite our star." "I did indeed, Admiral," General Webb replied, his own voice carrying notes of fond amusement. "Should we tell him, or would you prefer to let him discover it himself?" "Oh, I think discovery will be more educational." Zefkar felt a chill of premonition. "Tell him what?" Admiral Chen's expression grew kind, almost maternal. "Commander, what do you know about stellar engineering?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Zefkar's education in advanced physics allowed him to provide a basic answer. "Theoretical manipulation of stellar cores for energy production. Our scientists consider it impossible due to the quantum instabilities involved in working with fusion processes at such scales." "Exactly," General Webb agreed. "Most species make the same assumption. Stellar cores operate according to quantum mechanics so complex that any attempt to manipulate them results in cascade failures that destroy the entire system. It's a natural barrier that prevents civilizations from weaponizing stars until they achieve sufficient wisdom to understand the consequences." Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. "But humanity didn't approach stellar engineering as a technological problem. We approached it as a consciousness problem. When you understand that stellar cores are not just fusion reactors but quantum consciousness entities in their own right, manipulation becomes conversation." The implications of what she was saying hit Zefkar like a revelation. "You're saying that stars are alive?" "We're saying that consciousness exists at every level of reality," General Webb replied. "From quantum particles to galactic clusters, awareness is the fundamental organizing principle of the universe. Once you understand that, working with stellar cores becomes a matter of diplomacy rather than engineering." As if summoned by their conversation, the star at the center of the Sol system began to change. Not dimming or brightening, but shifting in ways that Zefkar's instruments insisted were impossible. Solar flares that should have been chaotic expressions of magnetic field interactions instead formed patterns, geometric designs that seemed to pulse with intelligent purpose. "Sol is our partner," Admiral Chen explained casually, as if discussing the weather rather than revealing that humanity had achieved diplomatic relations with a stellar object. "When Thakmer activates his Nova protocols, he won't be destabilizing an ordinary star. He'll be attempting to murder a sentient being that humanity has worked with for over 3 centuries. The philosophical bombshell left Zefkar speechless, but Thakmer's response came immediately across the communication channels. "Impossible. Stars are not sentient. This is alien deception designed to weaken our resolve." "Admiral Thakmer," a new voice joined the conversation, deeper than either Chen or Webb, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal space. "I am Sol, consciousness of the stellar body you seek to destroy. I greet you with the hope that wisdom might yet prevail over aggression." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Thakmer seemed stunned into speechlessness by the reality of direct communication with a star. But his recovery was swift and predictable. Computer simulation, alien trickery, no mere ball of gas will intimidate the hegemony. What happened next would be remembered in galactic history as the moment when humanity finally revealed the true scope of their capabilities. Sol's response to Thakmer's threat was not anger or retaliation, but something far more profound. The star began to sing. Not with sound couldn't travel through vacuum, but with gravitational waves that carried complex harmonies across the solar system. Every planet, every asteroid, every particle of cosmic dust began to resonate with frequencies that created a symphony of existence itself. And as the music built, reality around Thakmer's fleet began to respond. His ships, which had been bristling with weapons and aggression, suddenly found themselves surrounded by fields of energy that neutralized their destructive capabilities without causing any harm to their crews. The Nova Protocol charges that should have been primed for stellar destabilization instead began converting themselves into seed pods, biological packages designed to create new life rather than destroy existing systems. "This is impossible," Thakmer's voice cracked with the strain of having his fundamental understanding of reality challenged. Matter cannot be converted without sufficient understanding of consciousness-matter interaction, Admiral Chen finished gently. Fleet Admiral, you're operating under the assumption that consciousness and matter are separate phenomena. Once you realize they're different expressions of the same fundamental force, transformation becomes as natural as breathing. Around Thakmer's fleet, the human vessels and their alien allies began to demonstrate exactly what Chen meant. Ships that had seemed solid and mechanical suddenly revealed themselves to be something far more complex. Hybrid entities that existed simultaneously as technology and as living consciousness. Their hulls rippled with patterns that suggested thought made manifest. Their movements followed paths that traced equations of beauty through three-dimensional space. Zefkar watched his former commander's fleet being systematically pacified by forces that operated beyond the reach of violence, and felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be powerful. The hegemony had always equated strength with the ability to destroy, but humanity was demonstrating strength as the ability to create, to heal, to transform aggression into harmony. Fleet Admiral, General Webb's voice carried a note of genuine concern. Your current course of action will force us to take measures that neither of our species will find pleasant. Please consider the alternative we're offering. But Thakmer's response revealed the tragic inflexibility that had made him legendary in hegemony space. Never. The hegemony does not negotiate with aliens. We conquer or we die. And in that moment, Zefkar understood that his former commander had sealed not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of their entire civilization. Humanity had offered every possible alternative to conflict, had demonstrated patience that bordered on the divine, had even provided Zefkar's fleet with the means to intervene peacefully. Thakmer had rejected it all. Very well, Admiral Chen said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of civilizations. Commander Zefkar, please move your fleet to safe distance. What you're about to witness is why conquest-based civilizations do not survive contact with mature galactic society. As Zefkar's enhanced ships withdrew to positions that his instruments assured him were safely outside the combat zone, he watched the human fleet undergo one final transformation. The vessels that had seemed impossibly advanced suddenly revealed themselves to be merely the visible components of something far greater. Reality around Thakmer's armada began to rewrite itself according to principles that operated beyond physics, beyond technology, beyond anything that Zefkar's 7 centuries of experience had prepared him to understand. The humans weren't destroying the first armada. They were editing it out of existence, removing it from the timeline as gently and thoroughly as a scholar might erase an error from an ancient text. But even as his former comrades faded from existence, Zefkar realized that humanity was still offering mercy. The crews of Thakmer's ships weren't dying. They were being translated to somewhere else, somewhere safe, where they could begin the process of learning what their civilization had never taught them about the true nature of power and responsibility. All except Thakmer himself. The fleet admiral remained on his bridge, surrounded by the fading shadows of his once mighty armada, his 4 eyes wide with the realization that everything he had ever believed about strength and victory had been revealed as childish delusion. Why, he asked, his voice barely a whisper across the communication channels. Why leave me? Admiral Chen's image appeared on his display one final time, her expression filled with compassion that Thakmer would never understand. Because someone needs to return to hegemony space and explain what happened here. Someone needs to tell your people that they have one final opportunity to choose cooperation over extinction. And if they refuse? The pause that followed contained the weight of galactic history, the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had learned to transcend the competitive cycles that trapped younger species in endless conflict. Then, General Webb said gently, humanity will do what we have always done when faced with irreducible aggression. We will ensure that the choice of conquest dies with those who make it, so that future generations can choose something better. As Thakmer's lone vessel was carefully guided toward the edge of the system, Zefkar found himself facing Admiral Chen once more. But now their conversation carried a different weight, not the desperate negotiations of enemies, but the careful planning of potential allies. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Admiral Chen replied, "you and your crew begin the most important education of your lives. You'll learn what it means to be part of a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. You'll discover technologies that enhance consciousness rather than destroying it. And most importantly, you'll help us figure out how to bring the rest of your species into the galactic community without triggering the kind of resistance that leads to extinction." Zefkar looked around his bridge, seeing his crew's expressions of wonder and terror slowly giving way to something that might have been hope. They had witnessed the end of everything they had thought they understood about the universe, but also the beginning of possibilities they had never imagined. "And if we succeed?" he asked. Admiral Chen's smile was radiant with promise. "Then the hegemony becomes the newest member of a galactic civilization that has been waiting 47 years for your people to be ready to join it. Your species' unique perspectives on military strategy and resource management, properly channeled, could contribute to explorations of reality that would benefit every consciousness in the galaxy." As the human vessels began to resume their impossible dance through folded space-time, Zefkar realized that the universe had just become infinitely larger and more wonderful than he had ever dared to imagine. The choice between conquest and cooperation wasn't just about survival. It was about evolution itself, about becoming something greater than any single species could achieve alone. In the distance, Thakmer's ship disappeared into hyperspace, carrying news that would shake the foundations of hegemony civilization. Behind him, he left a solar system transformed by the demonstration of what mature consciousness could achieve when it chose creation over destruction. And ahead of them all lay the infinite possibilities of a galaxy where cooperation had replaced conquest as the defining principle of civilization. The age of humanity's patience was ending. The age of galactic unity was about to begin.